The solicitor arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Cecily Holt polished the silver. She did not know he was coming. No one had thought to tell her, which was itself a kind of answer to the question she had not permitted herself to ask in the 8 months since Sir Edmund Prewett had been laid in the churchyard at the edge of the estate's south field. She had gone on polishing the silver because someone had to, and because the new mistress, Mrs. Adeline Prewett, had made it clear in her first week of occupation that a household whose surfaces did not shine was a household conducting itself improperly, and Cecily had long since learned to conduct herself exactly as the house required. She was 23 years old. She had lived at Thornfield Park for 6 of those years, first as companion to old Sir Edmund's wife, then as a general servant of indeterminate station after Lady Prewett died and Sir Edmund grew quiet and forgetful, then as whatever the household needed her to be, which was most things, and none of them named. The silver polish was cold on her fingers, and the February light came sideways through the kitchen window, flat and without warmth, the kind of light that illuminated everything with equal indifference. The sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive above made her look up. A traveling chaise. Not the family's own vehicle, which was quartered in the coach-house and used with a reluctance that bordered on reverence by the widow Adeline. A hired chaise, the kind a man took when he was coming from some distance on business he did not intend to repeat. Cecily set down the candlestick she had been working and dried her hands on the cloth at her belt, and listened, and heard the particular quality of silence that followed the carriage door being opened and closed, and then the front door, and then the hall. She did not hear what followed. She was below stairs when it happened, and the house was large enough that voices from the library did not carry to the kitchen passage. What she heard, 40 minutes later, was Adeline Prewett's voice, which carried everywhere, raised to a register that the walls of Thornfield Park had not previously been asked to contain. The sound reached her in the linen room where she had retreated with a basket of folded napkins, and it brought with it a quality she could not immediately name. Not grief. Not anger, exactly. Something that sat at the back of the throat, where grief and fury met and became indistinguishable from one another, and then resolved into a single prolonged note of disbelief. She set the basket down on the linen room shelf and waited, because that was what she had learned to do. What she did not yet know was that the solicitor had brought a will. Not the will that had been read at the funeral in October, the brief and dutiful document that had left Thornfield Park and its income to Sir Edmund's daughter-in-law, Adeline, in life tenancy. A second will, dated 7 months after the first, witnessed by the village apothecary and the curate at St. Bartholomew's, and signed in a hand that the solicitor had identified with some effort as Sir Edmund's own, a hand shaken by age, but legible in its intention. The second will changed everything. Cecily Holt had come to Thornfield Park at 17 because her father had died and left 4 children and a house full of debts behind him, and because Sir Edmund Prewett had been her father's friend and had written to say that if she wished, there was a position in his household. She had wished. She had not had the luxury of wishing otherwise. She was the daughter of a clergyman, which placed her in the category of persons who were educated enough to be useful and had no means of being anything else. She had read everything in her father's library before she was 15, spoke French adequately, kept accounts in a neat hand, and could manage a sick room with the composure of someone who had learned that composure was the only practical thing a person in her position possessed. She had arrived at Thornfield Park with a single trunk and the careful manner of a young woman who understood precisely where she stood and intended to stand there without complaint. Sir Edmund had noticed these things. He noticed them. It seemed more than anyone else had. She had discovered this gradually, the way one discovers the qualities of a person one sees every day. A word here, a glance there, the focused quality of his attention when she read his correspondence aloud. He had said once, in the second year, when she had corrected a figure in the household accounts that his steward had put down incorrectly, "You see things, Miss Holt, that most people prefer not to see." He had said it as a fact, in the tone of a man noting a quality of the weather. To the household, she was simply the servant who had stayed on. Mrs. Beale the cook called her Miss Cecily, when in a generous mood, and nothing at all when not. The footmen Thomas and Jeremiah treated her with the careful distance of people who were not certain of her exact station, and had decided that uncertainty was safest, managed through avoidance. Adeline Praywet, who had arrived at Thornfield Park 2 months before Sir Edmund's death to attend him in what everyone understood would be his final season, referred to her as the girl in the way one refers to a piece of furniture that one has decided not to bother renaming. The girl, said with the kind of patient impatience that suggested the speaker had much better things to be doing than acknowledging the existence of the person she was addressing. It was a small word, and it was precise in its function, which was to indicate that the person it described was present, but not consequential. Useful, but not worth the effort of a name. Cecily had heard it first in the hallway outside Sir Edmund's bedroom, the 3rd week of Adeline's arrival, when Sir Edmund had asked for his correspondence to be read to him, and Adeline had stopped in the corridor and said, with a precision that required no raised voice to cut, "Send the girl." She had heard it again at the dining-room table, when the county solicitor's assistant had called on some question of accounts, and Adeline had gestured toward Cecily and said, "She managed the books before my arrival. The girl will know." And she had heard it from Mrs. Peake, the dressmaker, who had said it to her own apprentice in the fitting room without troubling to lower her voice. "The girl who was here before, she manages the linen." 3 voicings. 3 separate rooms. The same word each time, and each time it landed differently, because the word was not the wound. The wound was that it was accurate. She was a girl who managed things, in a house that had belonged to a man who was no longer there to call her by her name. Sir Edmund had called her Cecily. He had been the only person in that house who did. And the fact of it now, 8 months after his death, sat in her the way things sit when they have been placed there carefully and cannot be moved without damage. A small, permanent weight that she had learned to carry without drawing attention to it, because drawing attention to one's griefs was not a thing a person in her position could afford. If what he had written in the second will was true, it appeared that he had been saying goodbye to her, in the way old men who loved quietly said goodbye, not in words spoken into air, but in words set down on paper and sealed and left in the keeping of a man who could be trusted to arrive on the proper Tuesday. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew the sound of Adeline's voice through 2 walls and a corridor, and the cold weight of the linen basket on the shelf, and the February light going gray at the window, and the particular stillness of a house in which something significant had already happened, even if the person standing in the linen room was the last to learn of it. The library door opened and closed twice. Then the door to the passage leading toward the servants' stairs opened, and Mrs. Beale appeared in the linen room doorway with a candle, because the passage was dark in the afternoon at this time of year. Her face was arranged in an expression Cecily had never seen on it before, which was an expression of careful, provisional, uncomfortable respect. "Miss Holt," she said. And nothing else. Not Miss Cecily. Not the girl. Miss Holt, which was how one addressed a person of consequence. And the word sat strangely in the air between them, recognized by both as something that had changed. The solicitor's name was Mr. Alderton, and he was a small man with a careful manner and ink-stained fingers, and the look of someone who had delivered significant news before, and understood that significant news required one to be very still in one's body, while delivering it. He was still now. He stood when Cecily entered the library, which was not a thing that had happened to her in this house before. A man standing at her entrance, and the strangeness of it made her stop in the doorway for the space of one breath before she crossed the room to the chair across from him. Adeline Prewett was by the window, which gave Cecily the impression that she had placed herself there deliberately, as a person places themselves near a door when they anticipate needing to leave quickly. Her back was not quite to the room. Her fan was held at a height that communicated, with the precision of long practice, that she was present, but had placed herself above the proceedings. Her face was arranged in an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite shame, and was most precisely described as the expression of a woman whose map of a situation had proven incorrect, and who had not yet decided what to do with the discovery. "Miss Holt," said Mr. Alderton, and placed a document on the table between them. She read it twice, once quickly, for the shape of it, once slowly, for the words. Sir Edmund Prewett had left her Thornfield Park, not in life tenancy. Not as a secondary bequest after the life tenancy had run its course. In full and immediate ownership, with all attached lands comprising 430 acres, the income from the home farm and the 2 tenant farms to the east, the contents of the library, which had been specified by name in a separate codicil, and the use of the carriage. Mr. Alderton's eyes were on her face while she read, and they had the quality of a man who has watched many people receive news they were not expecting, and has learned to wait for the first wave of it to pass before continuing. He had also left a letter. The letter was in a sealed envelope addressed in the same shaking hand, and it read, in its entirety, "You were never my servant, Cecily. You were my daughter, if a man can make such a thing true by the force of his regard. I have done what I could. The house knows you. It has always known you. I trust you to know yourself. Edmund Prewett." The February light was still going gray at the window. The fire in the library grate needed tending, and she could see from where she sat that the coal scuttle was nearly empty. She noted these things because they were what she always noticed, and because the part of her mind that had spent 6 years managing this house did not stop managing it simply because the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she did not yet know how to stand on. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her apron. She became aware, then, of a sound from the entry hall. A second arrival while Mr. Alderton had been explaining the legal provisions to her, patiently and in the careful tone of a man who understands that patience is its own form of respect. The sound was of boots on stone and the low exchange of voices, and then the library door opened a second time, and the man who stood in it was not a servant and was not a solicitor. He was the Earl of Dunmore, and she had never seen him before, and she knew who he was the moment he stepped across the threshold, because his face was a copy, 20 years younger, of Sir Edmund's face in the miniature on the library mantelpiece. The same shape to the jaw, the same quality of focus in the eyes, the same stillness of a man who did not move without intention. Edmund Prewett the younger. Not the title. Sir Edmund had held no peerage. There was a nephew, the son of Sir Edmund's sister, who had been made Earl of Dunmore in the usual way of such things, and who had, she understood from the household's occasional mention of him, very little to do with Thornfield Park, or with anything it contained. He was 35 or 36, she thought. Tall, with a quality of stillness that was not calm exactly, but was the thing that lived alongside calm, in a man who had learned to contain what he felt. Dark hair, close-cropped, a jaw like something shaped from gray stone, and eyes that were the color of the winter sky at the moment it decided whether to clear or to cloud over. He wore a dark coat with the precise fit of a man who did not think about clothing and had excellent taste regardless, and there was dust on his boots that suggested he had come some distance without stopping to consider the dust. He looked at Mr. Alderton first, then at Adeline, then at Cecily. He looked at Cecily for a moment longer than he looked at the others. "Mr. Alderton," he said, his voice level, without the additional weight that men of his position sometimes applied to the names of solicitors to remind them of the difference in their stations. "I received your express." "My lord," said Mr. Alderton, and began to explain what he had already explained to Cecily. Cecily sat in the chair across the table and folded her hands in her lap and did not move. She was aware of the Earl standing at the edge of the room, of his stillness, of the quality of attention with which he listened to Mr. Alderton's careful summary. She had not yet determined what his presence signified. He was a nephew who had come to ensure the estate was managed. He was a man who had perhaps expected a different outcome, though she could not know that. She did not look at the Earl again until he spoke. "The will is uncontested?" he asked. The question was directed at Mr. Alderton, but the stillness of the room made it a question directed at everyone. "As to its validity, my lord, I have no reason to believe it will be contested successfully. The witnesses are credible, the document is properly executed, and Sir Edmund was, to my knowledge, entirely in possession of his faculties at the time of its composition." "I am not asking about the validity," said the Earl. "I am asking whether anyone in this room intends to contest it." The silence that followed had the quality of a room reconsidering its own arrangement. Adeline's hand moved slightly at her side, a barely visible adjustment that Cecily had learned, over 8 months, to read as the gesture of a woman recalculating a position she had believed was settled. Her fan shifted a 1/4 inch, her chin lifted a fraction. "I shall consult my own solicitor," Adeline said, the words level and precisely delivered, the words of a woman who had not yet decided to accept an outcome, but understood that public protest required a different instrument. "You are welcome to," said the Earl. He was still standing in the doorway. He had not advanced into the room. Cecily could not have said why that detail registered as it did, only that it seemed to her both careful and deliberate, as though he had placed himself at the threshold because he understood that the room's existing arrangement had a prior claim, and he was not yet certain of his place in it. You might not yet see it. The small thought arrived in her quietly, like a bird landing on a windowsill. He was watching her, and she did not know with what intention. And she was not certain what she wanted his intention to be. She was still in her apron. She had polish on her right thumbnail that she had not managed to entirely remove. The room smelled of coal smoke and old leather and the particular dustiness of books that had been frequently handled and carefully replaced, which was a smell she had associated with Sir Edmund for so long that she could not now smell it without something in her chest tightening in a way that was equal parts grief and recognition. "Miss Holt," said the Earl. Not a question. Not a command. A placement. As though he were noting where she was in the room so that he would not misplace her later. "My lord," she said. He looked at her for another moment in which nothing was said, and quite a great deal was communicated. And then he stepped back into the hall, and the door swung to its natural resting position. And the room was what it had been before, except that it was not. The weeks that followed moved as February moves, cold and gray and full of the particular uncertainty that precedes a change of season. Adeline remained at Thornfield Park on the grounds that she was consulting her solicitor, which was true, and also that she was not yet certain what it meant to be asked to leave a house she had believed she owned. Mrs. Beale began addressing Cecily as Miss Holt, with a consistency that suggested she had made a decision and intended to honor it. Thomas polished the front step without being asked, and Jeremiah brought coal for the library fire without waiting to be told. Small acts. The household orienting itself toward a new authority before the authority had yet claimed itself. The Earl did not leave. This was the detail that Cecily turned over in the evenings, sitting in the small room she had always occupied at the end of the east corridor, the fire low to save coal that habit still required her to conserve. He had taken the guest room on the second floor, the one with the view of the south field and the churchyard beyond it, and he was present in the house in the way that a person is present when they have not yet determined what their presence means. She heard his footstep on the stair in the mornings and his voice in the corridor at midday, discussing the estate's winter condition with the steward, Mr. Haynes, whose uncertainty about who he now served was a fair reflection of everyone's. He rose early and walked the estate grounds in the hour before breakfast. She knew this because she also rose early, and because the house's rhythms were her rhythms, and she noticed his boots in the hall mudroom, still damp with frost melt, on 3 consecutive mornings before she saw him leave on the 4th, and understood that the walk was a daily practice rather than an occasional one. On the 5th morning, she was in the kitchen garden cutting winter herbs, because Mrs. Beale was making a restorative soup for Thomas, who had a chill, and the rosemary she had cut was insufficient for the pot she had in mind. The garden was small and brown in February, the kitchen bed still dormant under a thin crust of frost, the lavender hedge a row of pale gray sticks along the southern wall. Cecily was kneeling by the rosemary bed with her scissors when she heard the garden gate. She looked up and found the Earl standing at it. He had stopped when he saw her. Not startled. He was not, she thought, a man who startled easily. He had simply stopped, the way one stops when one encounters something that requires a moment of attention before one proceeds. His coat was dark against the pale winter sky, and his breath was visible in the cold air, and he was looking at her with the particular quality of focus she had noticed in the library, which was not assessing, and was not polite, and was something more particular than either. "Miss Holt," he said. "My lord." He opened the gate and came into the garden without asking, which was the kind of thing a man of his station did not think to ask, and stood at a reasonable distance while she completed the cut and straightened. "The home farm," he said. "Do you know Jarvis's situation?" Jarvis was the home farm's tenant. She had managed the quarterly accounts with him for 3 years, since the previous steward had left and Mr. Haynes had arrived with a comprehensive knowledge of livestock and a marked reluctance for numbers. She knew the lease, the drainage problem, the condition of the outbuildings, and the fact that he had applied twice in the past 18 months for repairs that had not been made, and had continued farming in the patient way of a man who had learned that patience cost less than argument. "His lease renews in March," she said. "He has been reliable. The drainage on the north field wants attention. He has raised it twice and been told it would be addressed. It has not been addressed." The Earl was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the kitchen garden's arrangement with the expression of a man who was looking at something other than what he appeared to be looking at, and she had the distinct impression that the kitchen garden was not, at this particular moment, the primary subject of his attention. "Would you show me the accounts?" he asked. The question was not quite what she had expected, and the not quite expectedness of it was itself a kind of information. He had not asked Mr. Haynes, who held the title of steward. He had not asked Mr. Alderton, who would have had access to Sir Edmund's financial records. He had asked her. "Yes," she said. "This afternoon, if you wish." He nodded once, the slight forward inclination of a man who has said what he came to say and does not require elaboration, and left the garden the way he had come, the gate clicking shut behind him. She stood with the rosemary in her gloved hands and the cold February air on her face, and her pulse was doing something that had no practical use and that she had no practical means of stopping. So she acknowledged it for the space of one breath and then went inside. That afternoon he came to the library at 3 o'clock, and she was already there with the ledgers arranged on the side table. She had brought the household accounts for 3 years, the estate farm records, the tenancy agreements, and the notation books she kept at the end of each quarter, which were not official documents and had never been shown to anyone, but which contained, in her small, careful hand, every significant decision made and deferred in the management of Thornfield Park since she had begun keeping them. He sat across from her, and she explained what the numbers meant, and he listened in the way that people who understand numbers listen, not looking at the window or the fire while she spoke. When she had finished the summary of the first ledger, he asked 3 questions, each of which went directly to the point she had been making in more cautious language, and she answered them directly, without the softening she had learned to apply when speaking to men who required the information, but not the implication. He looked at her across the table. The fire was high enough now that the room was warm, and the light was amber and steady, and his face in it was not the closed face she had seen in the doorway of the library 2 weeks ago. It was a face in the process of deciding something. "You have managed this estate," he said. "As much as I was permitted," she said. "What would you have done differently?" She had not expected him to ask, and the unexpected quality of the question produced in her a small, involuntary stillness. She looked at the ledger for a moment, and then at his face, and his expression was the one she had come to associate with his most direct statements, which was no expression at all. The kind of blankness that in another man might have signaled indifference, but in him had revealed itself to be the face of a man who was paying very close attention. "The drainage on Jarvis's north field," she said. "The replacement of the kitchen range, which has needed replacement for 2 years and is currently running at approximately 2/3 of its former efficiency. The repointing of the south wall before next winter. And the library catalogue, which has not been updated since Lady Prewet's death and is now significantly inaccurate." She paused. "Those are the most immediate. There are others." "You know the library well," he said. "I have read most of it," she said. Another silence. The kind that asked no immediate question and therefore could not be answered, and sat in the room as a comfortable thing rather than an uncomfortable one, which was itself a quality she had not expected to encounter in this conversation. "My uncle spoke of you," the Earl said. Not as a declaration, as a fact being offered into the room to see what she would do with it. Her hands were still on the open ledger. She did not move them. "He was kind," she said. "He was not generally kind," said the Earl. "He was accurate. There is a difference." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had independently decided that the thing they were in the presence of was worth proceeding carefully with. The drainage on Jarvis's north field was assessed the following week. The Earl walked it himself, in the company of Cecily and Mr. Jarvis, on a morning sharp with cold, the field's low corner holding its pooled water with the patient indifference of years of neglect. He asked Jarvis the right questions in the right order, and listened to the answers with the completeness she had come to recognize as characteristic. The discussion that followed was conducted in terms that included both Cecily and Jarvis equally, which was a thing that Jarvis noticed with the careful alertness of a man who understood that the ground beneath his tenancy was shifting in a direction he had not previously experienced, and that the shift appeared to be in his favor. "It wants a proper channel to the east ditch," Jarvis said. "I have said so twice. Miss Holt confirmed the need in the records." "She did," said the Earl. and looked at Cecily with an expression that was brief and direct, and said nothing she could name, and then looked back at the field. In the evenings, when the household had settled, the Earl read in the library. She had come to know this the way she knew the house's other rhythms, the way she knew which stair creaked on the third step and which window rattled in a northeast wind. He was in there by 8, and he remained until 11, and the fire was banked before midnight. She came in on the 4th evening, not expecting him to be there, carrying the library catalog in her arms, because she had decided that if she was going to update it, she ought to begin. She had not expected to find the lamp already lit, and a man in the wing chair with a volume of early English poetry in his lap. He looked up when she entered, and did not tell her to leave, and did not make any adjustment of his posture to suggest that she had interrupted him. He looked at her, assessed the catalog in her arms, and returned to his reading. She sat at the small writing table in the corner, which had always been her table when she worked in the library, positioned well for the lamplight. She opened the catalog at the letter A and began. He did not speak for an hour. Then he said, "What are you reading?" "I am not reading," she said. "I am cataloging." "What have you been reading?" he corrected. And the correction was so precise and so patient that she had to look up. He had set down his book and was watching her with the direct attention she had stopped trying to deflect, because deflection, she had discovered, was not a thing he rewarded. "Cowper's letters," she said. "Your uncle had a marked copy." He was quiet for a moment. "He marked Cowper?" "In pencil." "Lightly." "He marked the passages about finding meaning in small things. Finding worth in a narrow life, he once called it. He said it to me directly, once, and I did not understand until I read the marks and saw what he meant. She had said more than she intended to, and she knew it, and she watched his face for the flicker of something that would tell her she had said too much. The flicker did not come. His face was the winter sky again, the moment of deciding, and then it resolved into something else. Something that was not quite what she had seen before. Not the careful stillness of a man assessing a room, but something quieter and less armored. "He marked mine too," he said. The words were quiet and not quite about a book, and she heard what was underneath them, which was a man describing a loss from the inside of it. She did not ask which volume. She understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has watched a grieving man from a close distance, that what he had just said was not a statement about a book. It was what he had come to Thornfield Park to give away. She understood it the following morning when she went to the library before breakfast and found on the side table, placed there with a deliberateness that required no note, a small volume of Cowper's letters. Not from the library's shelves, a personal copy, worn at the spine, with a name on the flyleaf in a hand she recognized as younger and steadier than Sir Edmund's shaking script, Nicholas Prewett. She held it for a long moment, her thumb on the worn spine, the kitchen sounds from below carrying up through the floor. Then she placed it on her working table and opened it to the first marked passage, which she found not at the beginning of the volume, but 2/3 through, at a letter dated many years before she had been born, in which Cowper had written about the consolation of a small, ordered life against the disorder of grief. "The world is not ours to hold," he had marked, in the same light pencil his uncle used. "We are its tenants," briefly. She thought about that for some time. Adeline Prewett's solicitor arrived the following week and spent 3 hours in consultation, and left without the result Adeline had presumably hoped for. The house had been quiet all morning, with the quality of a house that is waiting for something to be decided. Cecily had gone on with the library catalog because there was no practical reason not to, and because the library was the room where she felt most firmly placed. Adeline came to her in the kitchen passage that evening. This was itself a significant thing. Adeline, who had not entered the kitchen passage since her first week of occupation, and had entered it then only to establish the hierarchy of the household, coming to Cecily in the place where Cecily worked. Her hands were folded. Her dress was correct. She had composed herself into the version of herself that did not require anything visible from anyone. "The will stands," said Adeline, the words arriving as though from a distance. A piece of weather, rather than a verdict, she had attempted to prevent. "I know," said Cecily. Adeline was silent for a moment, looking at the kitchen passage wall rather than at Cecily. Then she said, in a voice that had shed the precise polish of its usual register, "He left you a letter." "Yes." "Did he explain?" Adeline said, and then stopped and started again. "Did he explain why he did not tell me?" The question arrived without its usual certainty. It was a question that admitted that she had not known, and that not knowing had cost her something she had built her expectations upon, and that she was standing now in a kitchen passage asking a servant, and that the servant was no longer precisely a servant, and that all of this was territory she had no map for. "No," said Cecily. "He did not explain that." Adeline looked at her for a moment, and in that moment Cecily saw something she had not previously been permitted to see, that Adeline was a woman who had spent a significant portion of her life inside a house she did not own, managing a situation she had not chosen, for a man she had cared for in her particular way. She had believed the house was what he had left her for that care. The belief had been wrong, and she had not known it until a Tuesday when a solicitor arrived. She was not a villain. She was a person whose map had been inaccurate, and who was standing in the kitchen passage of her former certainty, recalculating. "You may remain through the spring," said Cecily, and kept her voice level because she had no desire to deliver this as a victory, which it was not. It was a decision about how one occupies a house, and about what kind of person one intended to be in it. "While you make your arrangements." Adeline looked at her for another moment, and then left the passage without speaking, which was a form of acceptance that Cecily understood. The Earl was in the library again that evening. She had become accustomed to finding him there, which was itself a form of information she was still in the process of organizing, the way one organizes information that arrives in a category one had not previously created. She sat at her table and opened the catalog, and they worked in their accustomed silence, which was now a silence that had accumulated enough shared history to be comfortable, which was something she had not had with many people in this house, and which she held with care. He set his book down at 9:30 and looked across the room at her, and the quality of the look was different from any look she had seen before, which was to say it was not assessing or careful or held back from what it intended. It was simply present. "Cecily," he said. She looked up. He had used her given name, the first time in this house, in 6 years, that any voice other than Sir Edmund's had done so. The sound of it was different in his register, lower and more deliberate, and she felt the difference in her chest in the way one feels a change of weather before it arrives. A warmth that had no business being there at 9:30 in a February library, and that she was not going to pretend was not there. "My lord," she said, because she did not yet know what else to say. "I intend to speak to you directly," he said. A warning and a courtesy both. He was telling her what was coming. He was giving her the moment to prepare. "Then please do," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet before anything he intended to say with accuracy. The fire was steady in the grate. She was aware of her hands on the catalog, the slight roughness of her right thumbnail, and she was aware of him across the room with a completeness of attention that had been building over weeks, and that she had declined to name because naming it required deciding what to do about it. "My uncle left you this house because he knew it would be managed correctly," he said. "I have spent 4 weeks observing how it is managed." He was right. This was not all of what he meant to say. She waited. "I have also spent 4 weeks in a closer acquaintance with you than I expected when I arrived," he said. "And I find that I am not prepared to leave it behind when I go." The fire crackled once and settled. Outside, the February night pressed against the windows, cold and still. His face in the lamplight was open in a way she had not seen it before, the careful discipline of it laid aside, and she understood that this was not a thing he did easily. This opening. And that the fact of it meant something. "You are the Earl of Dunmore," she said. The words were not an objection. They were the thing that needed to be named, because both of them knew it sat in the room, and one of them ought to acknowledge it. "I am," he said. "And you are the mistress of Thornfield Park, which is the house my uncle loved more than any other place he lived in, and which he left to the person he believed loved it as it deserved to be loved." He paused. "I do not think he was wrong." She was quiet for a moment. She was aware of her hands on the catalogue, and of the distance across the library between them, and of the quality of attention with which he was watching her. The particular focus she had first noticed in the doorway on the day of the solicitor's visit, which had not wavered in 4 weeks, which she had observed and catalogued as precisely as she catalogued the library's holdings, noting each instance without drawing conclusions, the way one gathers evidence carefully before committing to a reading. "I should like to know," she said carefully, "whether you mean this as a practical arrangement or as something else." "I mean it as something else," he said, and the words were plain and quiet, and left no room for misunderstanding. "Though I am told, I am not skilled at making that distinction legible in my manner." The last clause arrived with something that was almost, barely, the ghost of amusement, self-aware and brief, and immediately replaced by the directness that was his primary register. She thought, despite herself, of Mrs. Beale saying to Thomas, not unkindly, that he was a man of few words, and none of them the warm sort, which had made Cecily look at her own hands and not say what she thought, which was that she had found his words quite sufficient. That she had, in fact, been finding them so for some weeks, and had said nothing because the territory was new, and she had learned that new territory required careful walking. "You are legible enough," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite the expression she had seen before, not the careful assessment or the deliberating sky. Something more simply present and less contained. And she felt the shift in herself as a warmth at the back of her ribs that she had no intention of concealing, because there was no practical reason to conceal it, and because concealment was a habit she had developed in this house when concealment was necessary, and she was beginning to understand that the house had changed. "I would not ask you to leave Thornfield Park," he said. "It is yours. I would ask rather whether you would permit me to remain in it." He paused, and the pause had the quality of a man who understands that the next word is irrevocable and says it anyway. "Permanently, I mean." She looked at him for a long moment across the library, across the accumulated warmth of 4 weeks of evenings and the smell of coal smoke and old books, and she thought of the letter in her pocket. The words read so many times by now that they had settled into her like a stone settling into water. "The house knows you. It has always known you." "Yes," she said. "I would permit that." He rose from the chair and crossed the library to where she sat. Not quickly. With the deliberate pace of a man who understood that the distance between them was significant and intended to honor that significance by covering it carefully. He stood at the edge of the writing table, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold room, his hand at rest near hers on the table's surface, the backs of their fingers nearly touching. He looked at her with an expression that had finally shed everything it had been keeping back. She turned her hand over. His fingers closed around it, not urgently, with the quiet certainty of a man who has made a decision and understood its weight and intends to carry it. They remained like that for a long moment, the fire settling in the grate, the lamp steady on the open catalog, the winter night pressing gently at the windows. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, a single slow movement that said what neither of them had yet said in so many words, and she felt it from her hand to the center of her chest in a way that was not at all practical and did not need to be. She was still in her working dress. The catalog was half finished. The silver needed polishing in the morning, and the drainage on Jarvis's north field was still to be properly addressed, and the kitchen range would eventually require replacement regardless of who paid for it. The house was hers, and she was in it, and the man who was in it with her was warm and quiet, and not going anywhere. He said her name once more in the lamplight, without any other words attached to it, and she understood that he had given her the name as a man gives a name when he means it to belong to him, to use for a very long time. They were married in April at St. Bartholomew's, with Mr. Alderton in attendance as a witness, and Mr. Jarvis and his wife seated in the second pew, with careful Sunday dignity, and Mrs. Beale crying in a manner she would have denied if asked. Adeline Pruett had departed for her sister's house in Bath the week prior, with the household's good wishes and a formal courtesy from the Earl that gave her no cause for complaint, and the drawing-room at Thornfield Park was rearranged to accommodate the gathering afterward, which was small and warm, and precisely what the occasion warranted. The summer came as summers do in the English countryside, unassuming and competent. The home farm's drainage was repaired in May, a proper channel cut to the east ditch, as Jarvis had said it ought to be. Mr. Jarvis renewed his lease in June without difficulty. The kitchen range was replaced in July, to Mrs. Beale's considerable relief. The south wall's repointing was assessed and begun in August. The library catalog was completed in August as well. On the evening of the day, she wrote the final entry. Cecily came into the library and found him there with Cowper's letters in his lap, the worn personal copy that she had replaced on his table after reading it, and that he had placed on the shelf with the others, in its proper alphabetical position, where it had remained for 6 months. He was reading at the passage he had marked years before, and he looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to know best, which was the expression of a man who had found the thing he had not known he was looking for, and had the sense to stay where he had found it. She sat down in the chair beside him, close enough that their arms touched, and the library's familiar warmth settled around them both. He closed the book and set it aside, and did not reach for another. Outside, the summer evening was still and full of birdsong, and the south field was green where it had been gray in February, and the churchyard at its edge held its quiet collection of stones in the long light, and Sir Edmund Stone among them, unmarked except for his name and the years that had bounded him. She had the letter still, in the small drawer of the writing table that was her table now, without qualification, without anyone in the house needing to decide whether it was proper. She did not need to read it to remember it. She had known it by heart since the second reading. The house knows you. It has always known you. She pressed her shoulder lightly against his in the quiet room, and he turned his palm up on the chair's arm without looking away from the window, and she placed her hand in it, and his fingers closed around hers with the same quiet certainty they had carried in February when the February night had been pressing against the glass and the catalog had been half finished on the table. the house settled around them both. The evening sounds of it familiar and specific and hers. The creak of the stair under Mrs. Beale's weight. The soft close of the kitchen door. The particular note of the east wind in the chimney flue. If you have been here since February, you know what Cecily Holt earned was never a house or a title. It was the rarer thing and the more valuable. Leave a word in the quiet if this story found you. She did not get up to tend the lamp. The light was sufficient. It always had been.